Hello everyone, welcome back. This is a new lecture in your course, Mastering Docker. My name is Ahmed for Avionics, and this is section 3 of our course. We are discussing Docker containers. Now, let's have a look at working with multiple containers in Docker. As we have mentioned earlier in this course, Docker solves one major problem of having to create and work with a number of different environments. And if you remember from section 1, we said that that's part of the Agile software development model, in which developers need to create multiple environments and multiple iterations of the product lifecycle and release the software in its most basic form as fast as possible. So that requires, as we said, a number of environments working together in the same time in parallel to save time and also to save costs. So Docker solves this problem by issuing containers, and each container is, as we said, as we have seen, completely isolated than other containers. If you want two containers to see each other and interact with each other, you'll have to explicitly do that using the --link flag, as we have seen in a previous lecture. But as the number of containers grows larger and larger, the naming convention that you're going to use will be a major challenge. Now, as you can see here in our example system, when we created those servers that we used to test the PID namespace isolation, as you can see here, we chose server 1 and server 2, which are not very descriptive names. But imagine now that you have like 10 or 15 web server environments, and all of them are using the Nginx web server container or the Apache HTTPD container. Now, just naming them HTTPD 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on is not descriptive at all, and you will have a hard time trying to remember which container served which purpose. And the problem starts to get even worse if you forgot to use the --name flag to manually assign a name to the container, because at that time the container will not have a name. So you'll have to stick to a pattern, you'll have to stick to a naming convention that will be helpful for you and for your team members if you're working in a team to quickly recognize which container is serving which purpose and which environment is hosted on which container. Now let's have a look at how Docker deals with multiple containers, how it assigns IDs, and also how it assigns human-friendly names to the containers that you create on it. Let's first start with the container IDs, and as we have mentioned previously, the container ID that appears in the output of docker ps command is not the full container ID, it is just the first 12 characters of this container ID, and we have mentioned also that this is very, very less likely to be repeated. It is completely random and it is too large to have duplicates. But what if you want to have a look at the container ID, the full container ID, not just the first 12 characters? Let's, for example, use the create command this time. And the difference between the create and the run command is that the create command will not launch the container. It will just create it and put it in the stopped state. So let's create a new container. We'll not even give it a friendly name. We'll just use an image busybox. As you can see here, Docker has created the container for us, and it has assigned it this ID. This number, or this string, consists of 65 characters. Those 65 characters is just a hexadecimal encoding of a 1024 number. This is just the hexadecimal representation of this very, very large number, and this is used as the container ID or the CID. And as we have mentioned before, you can interact with the container either with its name, with its short ID that is the first 12 characters of the container ID, or with the full ID of the container, which is the 65 character long string. Now, if you're working in a Linux shell or a POSIX compliant shell, like for example on Windows you can use the CYGWin, or if you're working in a Mac OS X, which by default uses Bash as its shell, you can use this form to store the ID of the container, or sometimes called the CID, into a variable and subsequently use it in your scripts. So for example, I can say CID, which is a variable, and then I will pass in a command that will create a container for me. So it's busybox, I'll close the bracket, and this could also have been done using this form. If you don't like to use the brackets and the $sign, you can use it like this. This is a variable that is called CID. I can call it using the echo command, but I have to pass in, of course, the $sign. If you're working with Bash, you will know what I mean. If I press enter, as you can see here, the variable contains the container ID of the container that I have just created. That is one way. We have another way where you can store this container ID physically in a file on your host system. That is by using the --CID file like this. If I use --CID file flag, I will have to pass in the path to a file where I want to store the container ID. let's say I will call it my container dot cid, and I'll place this in the /temp file system. Okay, there is no dash, sorry, it's cid file, one word. Okay, and it has done two things. It has displayed the container ID to me on the standard output so that I can further store it in a variable as we have did in the previous example, but it has also populated that file for me with the container ID. As you can see here, it added this container ID as the first and only line in /temp/mycontainer.cid. The interesting part here is that if I try to rerun this command, if I try to create a new container from BusyBox using the CID file that I used in the previous container, the command will simply not work. You will have to either delete mycontainer.cid or rename it to another name so that you can use this file name again to store the CID or the container ID of the container. So that is another protection provided by Docker, preventing you from creating containers with duplicate CIDs or preventing you from creating duplicate containers. If you are using a CID file that has been used with another container, Docker will alert you that you are using a CID file of an already running container. And that brings us to the end of this lecture. In the coming lecture, we're going to see how Docker assigns human-friendly names to containers, so see you next.